Imagine yourself in a time when voices were being silenced, when to simply exist as a black artist in America was an act of defiance. Now imagine stepping into that space and not just speaking, but declaring, "We've been here since the beginning, and we're not going anywhere." Welcome to History Talk for History Shock. I'm your host, Bradley, and today we're giving a deep dive into Langston Hughes' powerful poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Written when Hughes was just 17, this poem is both a tribute to the history of the African diaspora and a profound act of reclaiming identity and triumph. Raised by his grandmother until her passing in his teenage years, Hughes' grandmother, Mary Patterson Langston, played a crucial role in shaping his early sense of racial pride. She was the widow of a freed man who had participated in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and her stories about resilience and struggles gave Hughes a strong connection to Black history. As a Mexican American, I'm reminded of another great work of poetry, Rodolfo Gonzalez's I Am Joaquin. It is why I chose this piece of Hughes's work. I believe it's a foundation in projecting his voice for the greater good of his own heritage, and it has garnered much strength in other marginalized communities as well, and has just set the example. Just as Hughes' words celebrated the resilience and strength of Black communities, I believe Gonzalez's poem became a rallying cry for the Chicano identity, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. Both works serve as a testament to how marginalized communities and voices use poetry to fight erasure and assert cultural pride.
I am Joaquin, lost in a world of confusion, caught up in the whirl of a gringo society. I am the masses of my people and I refuse to be absorbed. I am Joaquin.
Joaquin is a life of all of our people. Joaquin is one of us and is all of us.
But back to Hughes. His voice wasn't just his own. It became a collective voice for African Americans during one of the most transformative periods in U.S. history, the Harlem Renaissance. Today, we'll unpack his poem, analyze its structure and content, and explore its historical and cultural significance. So let's start by getting to know the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, which flourished in the 1920s and early 1930s, was more than a literary movement. It was a cultural explosion that reshaped the way African Americans were perceived, both by themselves and by society. Centered in Harlem, New York, this period saw the rise of Black writers, musicians, and artists who used their craft to challenge stereotypes and celebrate their heritage.
And I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave.
Hughes' work, in this case, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, encapsulated the Renaissance's spirit. By evoking rivers that spanned continents and centuries, he tied the African American experience to a global and historical narrative. In many ways, Hughes' poetry shares similarities with Gonzalez's I Am Joaquin. Gonzalez wrote about reclaiming a Chicano identity, connecting his people struggles to a history of resilience and revolution. Hughes, too, was looking back to move forward, grounding his community and the knowledge of its deep roots. Both men used their poetry to say, "We are more than what history says about us, as we are history." Hughes published The Negro Speaks of Rivers in The Crisis, a magazine founded by the NAACP. This poem marked the beginning of his literary ascent, cementing his role in the movement. Harlem itself became more than a backdrop. It was a haven where Black voices could be unapologetically heard and celebrated. Hughes later wrote about this period, and I quote, "Harlem was like a great magnet for the Negro intellectual, pulling him from everywhere." Public reactions, Black and white perspectives. When The Negro Speaks of Rivers was first published in The Crisis in 1921, it received immediate acclaim from Black readers. The poem resonated because it was unapologetically Black and deeply proud, a reclamation of history that Black communities could see themselves in for the first time. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, the editor of The Crisis, championed Hughes' work as emblematic of the Renaissance's goals. Du Bois enjoyed that Hughes wrote about true things, real things, stating, "Mr. Hughes does not for a moment make the cabarets of Harlem beautiful and desirable. He paints them with their sobs and tawdry evil, and he paints evil." White reactions, however, were varied. On one hand, progressive figures like Carl Van Vechten supported Hughes, praising his lyrical genius and helping promote his work in literary circles. Van Vechten's advocacy gave Hughes access to a broader audience, but not all white critics were as enthusiastic. Some dismissed his focus on black life as overly political or too raw, reflecting the racial tensions of the time. In a letter sent personally to Hughes from Vechten in the later 1930s, we open with, "Your letters are works of art, and pleasing to the mind and eye." Still, Hughes wasn't writing for approval. His audience was his community. His mission was to tell the truth, and for that, he earned the enduring respect of figures like Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, and others who were leading voices of the Renaissance. When Hughes uses rivers, he's reaching for something timeless, something vast. They carry stories, they sustain life, and they bear witness to the rise and fall of civilizations. In The Negro Speaks of Rivers, they serve as both literal and symbolic connectors, linking places, cultures, and moments in time. Structurally, the poem is tied together by the possessive I. Hughes begins each stanza with it, emphasizing an almost omnipresent narrator, someone who has seen it all, lived it all, and carries the weight of these histories. It's a deliberate choice, one that gives the speaker authority and credibility. The I is not just an individual, it's a collective voice. It represents the shared experiences of the African diaspora. The rivers themselves are symbolic of endurance and continuity. They're ancient, yet they persist, carving paths through landscapes and shaping the world around them. Rivers are a fitting metaphor for history. The repetition of the phrase, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers," reinforces the metaphor. Rivers are deep, layered, and full of history. They carry sediment, just as the soul carries memories and experiences. Hughes is saying that the African American soul, shaped by triumphs and tragedies, has a depth that parallels rivers themselves. For Hughes, rivers symbolizes the resilience of the African diaspora. They've witnessed civilizations rise and fall, endured the horrors of colonization and slavery, and yet they remain steady and strong, much like the people Hughes was writing about. Hughes is deliberate in each river he mentions. The four embody key moments in African and African American history. These rivers, Euphrates, Congo, Nile, and Mississippi, map out a journey from the beginnings of human civilizations to the struggles and triumphs of Black America. Let's explore why these rivers matter. Let's start with the Euphrates, the river Hughes names first in The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Historically, the Euphrates is one of the two major rivers of Mesopotamia, alongside the Tigris. This region, known as Fertile Crescent, is widely regarded as the cradle of the civilization. It was here that humans first cultivated crops, domesticated animals, and built some of the earliest cities like Ur and Babylon. For Hughes, to place the African diaspora within this context is a bold and revolutionary choice. The Euphrates represents humanity's shared beginnings, but Hughes is making a specific point. African history doesn't start with slavery or colonization. By saying, "I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young," he asserts that African people were there at the dawn of civilization itself. The framing challenges Eurocentric narratives that often omit African contributions to early human history. Hughes reclaims the Euphrates as part of the heritage of Black people, situating them not as passive subjects of history but as active participants in its earliest chapters. It's a subtle yet profound act of reclamation, connecting the African diaspora to this ancient river, and by extension to the origins of human progress. Next, we move to the Congo River, a river that holds deep symbolic weight for African identity. The Congo, flowing through Central Africa, is one of the longest rivers in the world and has been a lifeline for civilizations in the region for thousands of years. Before colonization, kingdoms like the Congo Luba, and Lunda thrived along its banks. These were societies rich in trade, culture, and governance, far from the stereotypes of primitive Africa perpetuated by colonial and Western narratives. But the Congo story takes a darker turn during the colonial period. Under King Leopold II of Belgium, the Congo became ground zero for one of history's most brutal regimes. The exploitation of rubber and ivory came at an unimaginable cost. Millions of lives lost, families destroyed, and a legacy of trauma that continues to affect the region. The violent history is etched into the Congo's water, and this makes Hughes' references to it all the more poignant. Hughes writes, "I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep." The word lulled is striking here. It suggests peace, rest, and a sense of belonging. But how do we reconcile this image with Congo's violent history under colonial rule? Hughes isn't ignoring the suffering tied to the Congo. Instead, he's reclaiming its deeper significance. He's pointing to the resilience and creativity of the African people who lived along its banks long before colonization and who have endured its aftermath. For the African diaspora, the Congo symbolizes roots. It's a reminder of a vibrant heritage, at a time when African civilizations were thriving. By including the Congo, Hughes is saying, we are not defined by the pain inflicted upon us. We are defined by our history, we are defined by our strength, and we are defined by our ability to endure. In a way, the Congo becomes a metaphor for the duality of the Black experience, a history of both immense suffering and unyielding resilience. Then there's the Nile, a river synonymous with grandeur and legacy. Of all the rivers Hughes mentions, this one stands out as a monument, literally and metaphorically, to African greatness. Stretching over 4,000 miles, the Nile is the lifeblood of northeastern Africa and was the foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization. When Hughes writes, "I looked upon the Nile and raised pyramids above it," he's linking the African diaspora to one of the history's most celebrated civilizations. For centuries, its waters sustained agriculture, supported trade, and shaped a society that was remarkably advanced in art, science, and architecture. The pyramids referenced in Hughes' line remain enduring symbols of that brilliance, marvels of engineering that still defy modern understanding. But here's the thing, for much of history, Egypt's contributions to human civilization were divorced from their African roots. Western narratives often romanticize Egypt as part of the Mediterranean world, erasing its connection to the rest of the African continent. Hughes, however, uses the Nile to reclaim Egypt as an integral part of African history. His words remind us that African civilization was not a peripheral or primitive, it was central, foundational, and awe-inspiring. This reclamation is crucial for understanding the African diaspora. For Black Americans living in the 1920s, amid the pervasive racism of Jim Crow and the ongoing struggles for civil rights, Hughes references the Nile to serve as a powerful reminder of their heritage. It said, "We are descendants of greatness." The Nile also represents continuity. It's one of the longest rivers in the world, flowing through multiple countries and cultures, uniting them in its path. Hughes' invocation of the Nile suggests that African identity, like the river, flows across borders and generations. It's not confined to one place or time, it's expansive and it's enduring. And let's not forget the symbolism of the water itself. The Nile provided the resources that allowed ancient Egypt to flourish. And in the same way, the African diaspora's resilience and creativity have fueled cultural, intellectual, and social advancements across the globe. Hughes is drawing a parallel here. Just as the Nile nurtured one of history's greatest civilizations, so too does the African spirit nurture progress and innovation. What makes the Nile particularly fascinating in the context of this poem is its dual role as both a literal and a metaphorical foundation. The pyramids, after all, didn't just rise, they were built by hands, ingenuity, and sheer willpower. By referencing the act of raising the pyramids, Hughes acknowledges the labor, he acknowledges the brilliance and overall vision that created them. This is a direct counter to narratives that reduce Black contributions to physical toil or suffering. It's a reminder that Black history is also a story of creation, innovation, and transformation. Finally, we come to the Mississippi, the only river in Hughes' poem that's rooted in American soil. The Mississippi River, winding over 2,300 miles through the United States, has been central to the American history, and by extension to the story of African Americans as well. During the transatlantic slave trade, the Mississippi was a critical artery for transporting enslaved peoples and goods. Later, it became a site of transformation during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. For African Americans, the Mississippi is both a site of unimaginable pain and a symbol of resilience and hope. Hughes writes, "I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans." This line situates the river within a historical moment, the abolition of slavery. But more than that, it captures the Mississippi's duality, a witness to centuries of struggle, yet also a source of life, renewal, and change. When Hughes describes the river turning from muddy to golden, he's offering a metaphor for transformation. It's about finding beauty and strength in the midst of hardship. For African Americans, the Mississippi isn't just a geographical feature, it's a part of their collective memory and identity. The inclusion of the Mississippi ties the African diaspora's global journey to the American landscape. It reminds us that Black history is deeply embedded in American history, and that the fight of liberation is still ongoing. As we wrap up our talk, I want to sit with what Langston Hughes gave us in The Negro Speaks of Rivers. This poem isn't just a reflection on history, it's a challenge. It invites us to think about the weight of human experience carried by rivers, the journeys they represent, and the people who've lived those journeys. Hughes uses these rivers to hold up a mirror to humanity, but it's not the kind of mirror that reflects a single moment. It's one that reflects millennia of struggle, of triumph, of resilience. And when I think about how Hughes repeats the word I throughout the poem, I'm struck by how deliberate that is. He's not just speaking as one man or one poet. He's speaking for the millions of African voices that came before him and those yet to come. It's deeply personal, but it's also very universal. For me, the poem stirs a mix of emotions. There's a sense of awe for the history it encapsulates, but there's also a sense of sorrow for the suffering it recalls. It gives me an unshakable sense of pride in the resilience it celebrates. It reminds us that Black identity, and really any marginalized identity, is not defined by oppression, but by the strength it takes to endure, and the creativity that blossoms in spite of it. What I find remarkable is how Hughes makes his history feel alive here. When he talks about bathing in the Euphrates, building pyramids along the Nile, hearing the Congo, or witnessing the transformation of the Mississippi, it's as though he's saying, we are all connected to this history, and it is ours to reclaim. And maybe that's why this poem resonates so much, even a century after it was written. It's not just about Black history, but it's about human history. Hughes doesn't ask for pity or even recognition. He asks for acknowledgement of the truth. This is a poem everyone should read, not just for its beauty, though it is stunning, but for the way it forces us to confront and even overlook some things. So how does it make me feel? It makes me feel humbled, it makes me feel inspired, and it makes me feel like I want to keep talking about these stories because they are far too important to forget, and I think others seem to forget that as well. Hughes reminds us that the history flows like a river. It's always moving, but it's always connected to where it started. And maybe that's the ultimate takeaway here. Whether it's the Euphrates or the Mississippi, these rivers don't just carry water. They carry memory, they carry identity, and they carry us. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I am Bradley Rickett.
I was about to lose my mind.
Until I heard of today's sponsor, HelloFresh. To put it as simple as possible, HelloFresh is ingredients in bags in a box that gets shipped to your house, and then you cook it into food. Go to HelloFresh.com and use my promo code I'mALittleStinker16 for 16 free meals, including free shipping. Link in the